Hi everyone. Today, I'm diving into a chilling piece of Ulster history. It's the brutal IRA kidnapping and murder of German businessman Thomas Niedermayor. One of the most notorious murders of the Ulster Troubles was that of Thomas Niedermayor, a respected German businessman and managing director of the Grundig electronics factory at Dunmurry. Niedermayor lived in Belfast with his wife and two daughters and had no connections of any sort either with Republican or Unionist politics. Niedermayor resided in a quiet middle-class estate, Glengoland Gardens, just on the edge of the Andersonstown district of Belfast. It is believed that he may once have been stopped by a provisional IRA group seeking to hijack a car and dissuaded them by showing them papers establishing his foreign nationality. Also leading provisional IRA terrorist Brian Keenan had been employed at the Grundig factory and would have been gathering intelligence for his nefarious terrorist activities. In addition, Niedermayor had diplomatic status as the honorary West German consul in Belfast. So the terrorist group knew that an important foreign citizen lived conveniently close to one of their own strongholds. Thomas Niedermayor's name came up again in their discussions in December 1973. 9 IRA members had been convicted of bomb attacks in London and were sentenced to life or long-term imprisonment in mid-November of that year. 2 of those sentenced to life, Marion and Dolores Price, went on hunger strike in order to draw attention to their claim to serve their sentences in Northern Ireland, rather than in British jails. Their hunger strike attracted international attention. The British authorities refused the sisters' claim and had them force-fed. To put additional pressure on the British government, the Provisional IRA decided to organize a kidnapping. In effect, they would demand the transfer of the Price sisters in return for the freedom of the kidnapped person. In order for this to be successful, someone of high status had to be found as their kidnapped victim. Niedermayor seemed the ideal person, since his kidnapping would not only severely embarrass the British government, but would also bring strong pressure from West Germany to obtain his release. The date for the kidnapping was set as 27 December. Niedermayor's wife was in hospital, and he had visited her that evening. Just after 10:45 p.m., the doorbell rang. It was answered by his daughter Renate, who found 2 men on the doorstep. They said they had crashed into Niedermayor's car, which was parked on the street. Niedermayor came out, still in carpet slippers, to look. They examined the German's Ford Granada car. Then, as Niedermayor returned towards his house, the men grabbed him and forced him into their own car, which had been waiting with engine running and a man at the wheel. They disappeared into the night. The abduction had been witnessed from across the road by Niedermayor's neighbor and colleague in the Grundig works, another German, Herbert Hook, who had been alerted by the sound of the car engine. At first, he supposed some prank was going on, but after telephoning the Niedermayor house and speaking to Renata, he called the police. Nothing more was heard. No public ransom demand was ever submitted. No one claimed responsibility for the kidnapping of Thomas Niedermayor. There was widespread sympathy for his family. Church leaders united in asking for anyone who could give information to do so, saying, "Amidst so much suffering and tragedy in Ireland at the present time, the disappearance of the German consul constitutes an altogether special case." Meanwhile, his wife was issuing anguished appeals for information about his fate and whereabouts. "Please let me know what has happened to my husband," she begged on television. "Give me peace within myself. No one can appreciate the agony and strain you are putting me and my daughters through." A few weeks later, she asked again, "Please give me some sign to put an end to this dreadful uncertainty. At least give me some information of where his body may be found, so that he can be decently buried and can rest in peace." But nothing came back. 6 months later, she issued her last and final appeal. "It is terrible living like this and never knowing. I beg these people to let me know. My life has been shattered." Gradually, a little information began to leak out. The Provisional IRA had sent a message to the British government soon after the kidnapping, stating that Niedermayor would be killed unless the Price sisters were moved to Northern Ireland. The British government had refused any negotiation, and the RUC had not been informed about the message. This information was established by the Democratic Unionist politician Ian Paisley, whose criticism of the British government was shared by many not in his party. The detectives who had been painstakingly following up every possible lead felt severely let down. Meanwhile, there was still no indication of Niedermayor's fate. The hunger strike went on into June and then came to an end. The Price sisters were ultimately moved to Armagh prison a year later. Any hopes in his family for the German consul's release following this were dashed. The silence continued. It was 7 years later, in March 1980, that a man's skeletal remains, with pieces of clothing, were found by the driver of an excavator clearing a dump at Colin Glen, the west side of Belfast, and not far from Andersonstown. This is now known to have been an undercover RUC operation, acting upon received intelligence. The police immediately carefully examined and removed the remains. In charge of the case was Detective Inspector Alan Simpson, who subsequently wrote a book about this and other investigations. His team were already virtually certain that the body was that of Herr Niedermayor, but it remained to be proved. Forensic investigation showed that the skull was indented in a way compatible with blows on the head from a pistol butt. Although these blows might not have been sufficient to cause death, it was clear from them and from the way the legs had been tied that the man had not died a natural death. Frau Ingeborg Niedermayor, who was still living in Belfast, was able to confirm the fragments of clothing as corresponding with her husband's. In the end, as often with fragmentary remains, it was the dead man's teeth and his dental records that proved conclusive in establishing who he was. A massive police operation to gather information now went into action. With international and especially German interest in the case again at full height, the Belfast CID were on their mettle to show results. Despite the complete lack of progress made by the police in the initial investigations, now, 7 years on, a number of productive leads were opened up and pursued, undoubtedly through the cooperation of informers and undercover agents. Some 4 weeks after the positive identification of the body, an early morning combined police-military operation pulled in 4 people for questioning. One was the woman who had been living in the house now known to be where the victim was held, in Hillhead Crescent, Andersonstown. A second was the owner of the Ford Cortina car, which had been borrowed for use in the kidnap. The 2 others were Eugene McManus, identified as adjutant of the Belfast Brigade of the Provisional IRA at the time, and John Bradley, identified as a training officer of the 1st Battalion of the Provisional IRA. Interrogated at Castlereagh Detention Center, the 4 yielded information which enabled the story of Thomas Niedermayer's kidnapping and death to be told. Approved by the IRA Army Council, the kidnapping was organized in Andersonstown. On Boxing Day 1973, the house was selected and its occupant told to vacate it for a few days. The following day, the car was borrowed from its owner in an Andersonstown drinking club. The kidnap went off according to plan, and Niedermayor was confined in an upstairs room in the house in Hillhead Crescent. Perhaps confident at first that he would be quickly released, he remained calm and tried to engage his captors in conversation, but they had been instructed not to talk to him. By the 3rd day of his imprisonment, Niedermayor was beginning to become agitated. On the excuse of going to the lavatory, he tried to escape but was restrained by the 4 terrorists, who included Bradley. The kidnapped victim struggled and shouted for help, at one point getting close to a window. The terrorists forced him back onto the mattress and tried to gag him and tie his legs. As the struggle continued, someone hit Niedermayor several times on the head with the butt of an automatic pistol. The 4 men piled on top of him, pressing his face into the mattress. Eventually, the prisoner's body went completely still, and they realized that he was dead. Most of this testimony came from Bradley, with McManus confirming the broader picture. The operation had gone disastrously wrong. Instead of a high-profile kidnap victim, the provisionals had a corpse. A damage limitation exercise was rapidly put into action. Under instructions, the terrorists arranged for the room in which Niedermayor had been held and murdered to be completely redecorated, the mattress disposed of, and a new bed supplied. They picked the dump site at Colin Glen and under cover of darkness dug a shallow grave. The body was brought out in the boot of a car and dropped in face first. According to Bradley, the 4 said a prayer over the grave before dragging an old mattress over it. Had it not been for a tip-off years later, the body might never have been found. The Provisional IRA clamped an order of silence over the affair. Nothing was said, no responsibility was claimed. The only 2 people to stand trial were Bradley and McManus, the former on a charge of false imprisonment and murder, and of membership of the Provisional IRA. The second on the ultimately reduced charges of withholding information, impeding the work of the police, and membership of the Provisional IRA. In the case of others, including Brian Keenan, known or suspected to have been involved, some of whom were already in prison, the police were unable to find sufficient evidence for commitment to trial or, as in the case of the house and car owners, accepted coercion as a reason for their complicity and silence, and did not press charges. The trial took place in February 1981 before Lord Justice Jones. Bradley pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. McManus pleaded guilty as charged and was given 5 years. The Niedermayor case, because of the involvement of a foreign citizen, because of the bungled handling by the kidnappers, because of the failure of the forces of justice to bring all the killers to account, and because of the British government's refusal to pass information on to the RUC, remains a shabby episode from a dreadful period. Brian Keenan, who as previously mentioned, had once been employed at the Grundig factory, is now widely believed to have masterminded the kidnapping. Convicted terrorist Keenan, a close personal associate of Jerry Adams, died in 2008. Adams stated at the funeral oration, "His working-class politics and his Republican and socialist principles were his constant guide through 4 decades of unstinting activism." That activism included the kidnapping, murder, and the dumping of Thomas Niedermayer's lifeless body in a rubbish dump. Keenan denied the grieving Niedermayor family the right to closure and a decent Christian burial. But the suffering of this tragic family was far from over. Ingeborg Niedermayor had been declared a widow by a German court in 1976. She believed that if she knew for certain what had become of her husband, she might feel better. "It was the not knowing," she said, "that continually nags at my mind and brings on periods of depression and anxiety." Since the kidnapping, she had only managed to survive from day to day. In June 1990, Ingeborg returned to Ireland and booked into a hotel in the seaside resort of Bray in County Wicklow. A few days later, her body was washed up on a beach at the neighboring resort of Greystones. Within a year, her younger daughter Renate, who had opened the door to the kidnappers and was then living in South Africa, also killed herself. In 1996, her older daughter Gabrielle, who had emigrated to Australia with her husband and raised 2 daughters there, also committed suicide. A few years later, she was followed by her husband, a family utterly destroyed. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story as moving as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.